The aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attack, most Americans were understandably shocked, angry, and frightened. Among other things, we wanted to know when we might expect the next attack and what we might do to minimize the danger. Into the breach stepped the Department of Homeland Security and the Attorney General of the United States. It is their job to gather data about terrorist intentions, sound the alarm, and tell us what to do. Most of us would be only too willing to comply with their recommendations. 90. The social animal, as we have seen, to be effective, warnings and instructions should be based on reliable evidence, and should be presented by a credible communicator. The communicator must clearly state what the threat is and what specific actions people should take to avoid a catastrophe. When a hurricane is coming, we are told to board up our windows and even abandon our homes if they are in the path of the storm. When rivers are in danger of flooding, we are warned to head for the high ground. If I were told that terrorists were going to attack my shopping mall this weekend, I would refrain from shopping. If I were told that terrorists were about to attack planes, trains, and buses, I would be inclined to postpone my trip. Any warning becomes ineffective if it is vague about what the danger is or where it is coming from or what people can do to avert the danger. In the years following September 11, 2001, high-ranking government officials issued several warnings of possible imminent terrorist attacks. Each of these warnings failed to meet even one of the necessary criteria to be effective. That is, the warnings were vague about the nature of the attack, vague about the time and place, and vague about what people should do to avoid becoming victims. The Director of Homeland Security warned us to be vigilant but, at the same time, not to let that interfere with our day-to-day lives. What exactly does such a statement mean? Perhaps it means that I should not cancel my trip to New York, but once aboard the airplane I should make sure that the guy sitting next to me doesn't ignite the explosives hidden in his underwear. If the situation were not so dangerous, one might see the humor in such warnings. Indeed, such warnings have provided material for the likes of Jon Stewart and David Letterman. For example, in 2003, government officials raised the threat level and urged citizens to stock up on plastic sheeting and duct tape so that we could tape up our windows and doors against a possible poison gas or anthrax attack. But some experts warned that such an action might cause people to suffocate. In response to that warning, government officials responded by saying, in effect, well, we said to stock up on that stuff, but we didn't say to use it. But, of course, the situation is dangerous. The possibility of a serious terrorist attack is real. Moreover, the behavior of our government officials is not simply inept, rather, I would suggest that it has done more harm than good. Scaring people without offering them a mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. 91. Sensible course of action leads to a heightened state of anxiety without producing constructive action. Worse still, people cannot tolerate living in a state of constant anxiety. Thus, if vague warnings recur and prove to be false alarms, most of us will eventually drift into a state of denial and become bored and complacent and will eventually stop listening. 44. Consensual statistical evidence versus a vivid personal example. Suppose you are in the market for a new car, and the two most important things you are looking for are reliability and longevity. That is, you don't care about looks, style, or mileage. What you do care about is the frequency of repair. As a reasonable and sensible person, you consult Consumer Reports and you learn that the car with the best repair record is the Volvo. Naturally, you decide to buy a Volvo. But suppose that, the night before you are to make the purchase, you attend a dinner party and announce your intention to one of your friends. He is incredulous. You can't be serious, he says. My cousin bought a Volvo last year and has had nothing but trouble ever since. First, the fuel injection system broke down, then the transmission fell out, then strange noises started to come from the engine, finally, oil started to drip from some unknown place. My poor cousin is literally afraid to drive the car for fear of what will happen next. Let's suppose the ranking made by Consumer Reports was based on a sample of 1,000 Volvo owners. Your friend's cousin's unfortunate experience has increased the size of the sample to 1001. It has added one negative case to your statistical bank. Logically, this should not affect your decision, but a large body of research by Richard Nisbet and his associates 45 indicates that such occurrences, because of their vividness, assume far more importance than their logical statistical status would imply. Indeed, such occurrences are frequently decisive. Thus, with the example of the plight of your friend's cousin firmly fixed in your mind, it would be very difficult for you to rush out and purchase a Volvo. In addition, the more vivid the examples are, the greater their persuasive power. A real-life demonstration of this comes from the area of energy conservation. Several years ago, my students and I set out to persuade homeowners to make the improvements necessary to have an energy-efficient house. 46 We worked with home auditors from local utility companies and taught them to use vivid examples. 92 The social animal, when recommending home improvements. For example, most auditors, when left to their own devices, simply point to cracks around doors and recommend that the homeowner install weather stripping. Instead, we trained several auditors to tell homeowners that if all the cracks around all the doors were added up, they would equal a hole the size of a basketball in their living room wall, and if you had a hole that size in your wall, wouldn't you want to patch it up? That's what weather stripping does. The results were striking. Auditors trained to use this kind of vivid language increased their effectiveness fourfold, whereas previously only 15% of the homeowners had the recommended work done. After the auditors began to use more vivid communication, this increased to 61%. Most people are more deeply influenced by one clear, vivid, personal example than by an abundance of statistical data. Thus, your friend's Volvo story or the thought of a basketball-sized hole in your living room will probably be extraordinarily powerful. This is undoubtedly one reason that testimonials are so effective, even when they are accompanied by statistical disclaimers. One-sided versus two-sided arguments. Suppose you are about to make a speech attempting to persuade your audience that capital punishment is necessary. Would you persuade more people if you simply stated your view and ignored the arguments against capital punishment? Or would you be more persuasive if you discussed the opposing arguments and attempted to refute them? Before trying to answer this question, let us take a close look at what is involved. If a communicator mentions the opposition's arguments, it might indicate that he or she is an objective, fair-minded person. This could enhance the speaker's trustworthiness and thus increase his or her effectiveness. On the other hand, if a communicator so much as mentions the arguments on the other side of the issue, it might suggest to the audience that the issue is controversial. This could confuse members of the audience, make them vacillate, and ultimately reduce the persuasiveness of the communication. With these possibilities in mind, it should not come as a surprise to the reader that there is no simple relation between one-sided arguments and the effectiveness of the communication. It depends to some extent upon how well-informed the audience is. The more well-informed the members of the audience, mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion 93 are, the less likely they are to be persuaded by a one-sided argument and the more likely they are to be persuaded by an argument that brings out the important opposing arguments and then proceeds to refute them. This makes sense. A well-informed person is more likely to know some of the counter-arguments. When the communicator avoids mentioning these, the knowledgeable members of the audience are likely to conclude that the communicator is either unfair or unable to refute such arguments. On the other hand, an uninformed person is less apt to know of the existence of opposing arguments. If the counter-argument is ignored, the less informed members of the audience are persuaded. If the counter-argument is presented, they may get confused. Another vital factor is the initial position of the audience. As we might expect, if a member of the audience is already predisposed to believe the communicator's argument, a one-sided presentation has a greater impact on his or her opinion than a two-sided presentation. If, however, a member of the audience is leaning in the opposite direction, then a two-sided refutational argument is more persuasive. 47 Most politicians seem to be well aware of this phenomenon. They tend to present vastly different kinds of speeches, depending upon who constitutes the audience. When talking to the party faithful, they almost invariably deliver a hell-raising set of arguments favoring their own party platform and candidacy. If they do mention the opposition, it is in a derisive, mocking tone. On the other hand, when appearing on network television or when speaking to any audience of mixed loyalties, they tend to take a more diplomatic position, giving the opposing view a reasonably accurate airing before proceeding to demolish it. The order of presentation: imagine you are running for the city council. You and your opponent are invited to address a large audience in the civic auditorium. It is a close election, many members of the audience are still undecided, and the outcome may hinge on your speech. You have worked hard on writing and rehearsing it. As you take your seat on the stage, the master of ceremonies asks whether you would prefer to lead off or speak last. You ponder this for a moment. You think, speaking first may have an advantage because first impressions are crucial. If I can get the audience on my side early, then my opponent will not only have to sell himself, he'll also have to unsell the audience on me. He'll be bucking a trend. On the other hand, if I speak, 94 the social animal, last, I may have an advantage because when the people leave the auditorium, they may remember the last thing they heard. The early statements made by my opponent, no matter how powerful, will be buried by my rhetoric simply because my speech will be more memorable. You stammer, I'd like to speak first, no, last, no, first, no, wait a minute. In confusion, you race off the stage, pull out your cell phone, and call your friend the social psychologist. Surely, she must know which order has the advantage. I'm afraid that if you expect a one-word answer, you are in for a disappointment. Moreover, if you wait to hear all of the social psychologist's elaborations and qualifying remarks, you might miss the opportunity of ever delivering your speech at all. Indeed, you might miss the election itself. Needless to say, the issue is a complex one involving both learning and retention. I'll try to state it as simply as possible. The issues are similar to the common sense issues that you, as our hypothetical politician, pondered alone. It is true that, all other things being equal, the audience's memory should be better for the speech made last, simply because it is closer in time to the election. On the other hand, the actual learning of the second material will not be as thorough as the learning of the first material, simply because the very existence of the first material disrupts and inhibits the learning process. Thus, from our knowledge of the phenomena of learning, it would appear that, all other things being equal, the first argument will be more effective. This is called the primacy effect. But from our knowledge of the phenomena of retention, on the other hand, it would appear that, all other things being equal, the last argument will be more effective. This is called the recency effect. The fact that these two approaches seemingly involve opposite predictions does not mean that it doesn't matter which argument comes first, nor does it mean that it is hopeless to attempt to make a definitive prediction. What it does mean is that, by knowing something about the way both inhibition and retention work, we can predict the conditions under which either the primacy effect or the recency effect will prevail. The crucial variable is time, that is, the amount of time separating the events in the situation, the amount of time between the first communication and the second communication, and the amount of time between the end of the second communication and the moment when the members of the audience, mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion 95, must finally make up their minds. Here are the crucial points. Inhibition is greatest if very little time elapses between the two communications. Here, the first communication produces maximum interference with the learning of the second communication. And a primacy effect will occur. The first speaker will have the advantage. Retention is greatest, and recency effects will therefore prevail, when the audience must make up its mind immediately after hearing the second communication. Okay. Are you still on the phone? Here's the plan. If you and your opponent are to present your arguments back to back, and if the election is still several days away, you should speak first. The primacy of your speech will interfere with the audience's ability to learn your opponent's arguments. With the election several days away, differential effects due to memory are negligible. But if the election is going to be held immediately after the second speech, and there is to be a prolonged coffee break between the two speeches, you would do well to speak last. Because of the coffee break between speeches, the interference of the first speech with the learning of the second speech will be minimal, because the audience must make up its mind right after the second speech. As the second speaker, you would have retention working for you, therefore, the recency effect would be dominant, all other things being equal. The last speech will be the more persuasive. These speculations were confirmed in an experiment by Norman Miller and Donald Campbell, 48. In this experiment, a simulated jury trial was arranged, in which participants were presented with a condensed version of the transcript of an actual jury trial of a suit for damages brought against the manufacturers of an allegedly defective vaporizer. The pro side of the argument consisted of the testimony of witnesses for the plaintiff, cross-examination of defense witnesses by the plaintiff's lawyer, and the opening and closing speeches of the plaintiff's lawyer. The con side of the argument consisted of the testimony of witnesses for the defense lawyer's cross-examinations, and his opening and closing speeches. The condensed version of this transcript was arranged so that all of the pro arguments were placed in one block and all of the con arguments were placed in another block. The investigators varied the interval between the reading of the two arguments and between the reading of the last argument and the announcement of the verdict. A recency effect was obtained when there was a large interval between the first, 96th the social animal, and second arguments and a small interval between the second argument and the verdict. A primacy effect was obtained when there was a small interval between the first and second arguments and a large interval between the second argument and the verdict. The topic of this experiment serves to underscore the immense practical significance these two phenomena may have. Most jurisdictions allow the prosecution to go first and last, thus giving the state the advantage of both primacy and recency effects. Because the order of presentation may influence a jury's verdict of guilt or innocence, I would recommend that our trial procedures be modified to prevent any possible miscarriages of justice due to primacy or recency effects. The size of the discrepancy. Suppose you are talking to an audience that strongly disagrees with your point of view. Will you be more effective if you present your position in its most extreme form, or if you modulate your position by presenting it in such a way that it does not seem terribly different from the audience's position? For example, suppose you believe people should exercise vigorously every day to stay healthy. Any physical activity would be helpful, but at least an hour's worth would be preferable. Your audience consists of college professors who seem to believe that turning the pages of a book is sufficient exercise for the average person. Would you change their opinion to a greater extent by arguing that people should begin a rigorous daily program of running, swimming, and calisthenics, or by suggesting a briefer, less taxing regimen? In short, what is the most effective level of discrepancy between the opinion of the audience and the recommendation of the communicator? This is a vital issue for any propagandist or educator. Let us look at this situation from the audience's point of view. As I mentioned in Chapter 2, most of us have a strong desire to be correct, to have the right opinions and to perform reasonable actions. When someone comes along and disagrees with us, it makes us feel uncomfortable because it suggests our opinions or actions may be wrong or based on misinformation. The greater the disagreement, the greater our discomfort. How can we reduce this discomfort? Simply by changing our opinions or actions. The greater the disagreement, the greater our opinion change will be. This line of reasoning, then, would suggest that the communicator should argue for the daily, mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion 97 program of rigorous exercise. The greater the discrepancy, the more the opinion change. Indeed, several investigators have found that this linear relation holds true. A good example of this relation was provided by an experiment by Philip Zimbardo, 49. Each of the college women recruited as participants for the experiment was asked to bring a close friend with her to the laboratory. Each pair of friends was presented with a case study of juvenile delinquency, and then each of the participants was asked, separately and in private, to indicate her recommendations on the matter. Each participant was led to believe her close friend disagreed with her, either by a small margin or by an extremely large margin. Zimbardo found that the greater the apparent discrepancy, the more the participants changed their opinions toward what they supposed were the opinions of their friends. However, a careful look at the research literature also turns up several experiments disconfirming the line of reasoning presented above. For example, James Whittaker 50 found a curvilinear relation between discrepancy and opinion change. By curvilinear, I mean that, as a small discrepancy increased somewhat, so did the degree of opinion change, but as the discrepancy continued to increase, opinion change began to slacken, and finally, as the discrepancy became large, the amount of opinion change became very small. When the discrepancy was very large, almost no opinion change was observed. Building on Whittaker's finding, Carl Hovland, O. J. Harvey, and Muzafer Sharif 51 argued that if a particular communication differs considerably from a person's own position, it is, in effect, outside of one's latitude of acceptance, and the individual will not be much influenced by it. In the experiment by Hovland and his colleagues, the communication was based on a red-hot issue, one the participants felt strongly about, whether their state should remain dry or go wet, that is, whether or not to change the law prohibiting the distribution and sale of alcoholic beverages. The voters of the state were virtually equally divided on this issue, and the participants were a representative sample. Some of the participants felt strongly that the state should remain dry, others felt strongly that it should go wet, and the rest took a moderate position. The participants were divided into groups of people reflecting all three positions. The members of each group were presented with communications supporting one of the three opinions, so that, in each group, there were participants who found the communication close to their own position, some who, 98 the social animal, found it moderately discrepant from their own position, and some who found it extremely discrepant from their own position. Specifically, some groups were presented with a wet message, which argued for the unlimited and unrestricted sale of liquor. Some groups were presented with a dry message, which argued for complete prohibition, and some groups were presented with a moderately wet message, which argued to allow some drinking but with certain controls and restrictions. The greatest opinion changes occurred when there was a moderate discrepancy between the actual message and the opinions of individual members of the groups. For a scientist, this is an exciting state of affairs, when a substantial number of research findings point in one direction and a similarly substantial number of research findings point in a different direction. It doesn't necessarily mean someone has to be wrong, rather, it suggests there is a significant factor that hasn't been accounted for, and this is indeed exciting, for it gives the scientist an opportunity to play detective. I beg the reader's indulgence here, for I would like to dwell on this issue, not only for its substantive value, but also because it provides us with an opportunity to analyze one of the more adventurous aspects of social psychology as a science. Basically, there are two ways of proceeding with this game of detective. We can begin by assembling all the experiments that show one result and all those that show the other result and painstakingly scrutinize them, looking for the one factor common to the experiments in Group A and lacking in Group B. Then we can try to determine, conceptually, why this factor should make a difference, or, conversely, we can begin by speculating conceptually about what factor or factors might make a difference. Then we can glance through the existing literature, with this conceptual lantern in hand, to see if those in Group A differ from those in Group B on this dimension. As a scientist, my personal preference is for the second mode. Accordingly, with two of my students, Judith Turner and Merrill Carlsmith, I began to speculate about what factor or factors might make such a difference. We began by accepting the notion discussed above: the greater the discrepancy, the greater the discomfort for the members of the audience. But we reasoned that this does not necessarily mean the members of an audience will change their opinion. There are at least four ways in which the members of an audience can reduce mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. 99. Their discomfort. They can change their opinion. They can induce the communicator to change his or her opinion. They can seek support for their original opinion by finding other people who share their views, in spite of what the communicator says. or they can derogate the communicator, convince themselves the communicator is stupid or immoral, and thereby invalidate that person's opinion. In many communication situations, including those in these experiments, the message is delivered either as a written statement or by a communicator who is not approachable by the audience. Also, the participant is often alone or part of an audience whose members have no opportunity to interact with one another. Thus, under these circumstances, it is virtually impossible for the recipients of the communication either to have immediate impact on the communicator's opinion or to seek immediate social support. This leaves the recipients two major ways of reducing this discomfort: they can change their opinion, or they can derogate the communicator. Under what circumstances would an individual find it easy or difficult to derogate the communicator? It would be very difficult to derogate a liked and respected personal friend. It would also be difficult to derogate someone who is a highly trustworthy expert on the issue under discussion. But if the communicator's credibility were questionable, it would be difficult not to derogate him or her. Following this line of reasoning, we suggested that, if a communicator's credibility were high, the greater the discrepancy between the communicator's opinions and the audience's opinions, the greater the influence exerted on the opinions of the audience. However, if the communicator's credibility were not very high, he or she would be, by definition, subject to derogation. This is not to say that the communicator couldn't influence the opinions of the audience. The communicator would probably be able to influence people to change their opinions if his or her opinions were not too different from theirs, but the more discrepant such a communicator's position is from those of the audience, the more the audience might begin to question his or her wisdom, intelligence, and sanity. The more they question his or her wisdom, intelligence, and sanity, the less likely they are to be influenced. Let's return to our example involving physical exercise. Imagine a 73-year-old man, with the body of a man half his age, who had just 100 the social animal, won the Boston Marathon. If he told me that a good way to stay in condition and live a long, healthy life was to exercise vigorously for at least 2 hours every day, I would believe him. Boy, would I believe him. He would get much more exercise out of me than if he suggested I should exercise for only 10 minutes a day. But suppose a somewhat less credible person, such as a high school track coach, were delivering the communication. If he suggested I exercise 10 minutes a day, his suggestion would be within my own latitude of acceptance, and he might influence my opinion and behavior. But if he advised me to embark on a program of vigorous exercise requiring 2 hours every day, I would be inclined to write him off as a quack, a health freak, a monomaniac, and I could comfortably continue being indolent. Thus, I would agree with Hovland, Harvey, and Sharif. People will consider an extremely discrepant communication to be outside their latitude of acceptance, but only if the communicator is not highly credible. Armed with these speculations, my students and I scrutinized the existing experiments on this issue, paying special attention to the ways in which the communicator was described. Lo and behold, we discovered that each of the experiments showing a direct linear relation between discrepancy and opinion change happened to describe the source of the communication as more credible than did those whose results showed a curvilinear relation. This confirmed our speculations about the role of credibility. But we didn't stop there. We constructed an experiment in which we systematically investigated the size of the discrepancy and the credibility of the communicator in one research design. 52 In this experiment, college women were asked to read several stanzas from obscure modern poetry and to rank them in terms of how good they were. Then each woman was given an essay to read purporting to be a criticism of modern poetry that specifically mentioned a stanza she had rated as poor. For some participants, the essayist described this particular stanza in glowing terms. This created a large discrepancy between the opinion of the communicator and the opinion voiced by the students in this experimental condition. For some participants, the essayist was only mildly favorable in the way he described the stanza. This set up a moderate discrepancy between the essayist and the students in this condition. In a third condition, the essayist was mildly scornful in his treatment of the stanza, which placed the recipients of this communication in a mild discrepancy. Mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion 101. Situation. Finally, to one half of the women in the experiment, the writer of the essay was identified as the poet T.S. Eliot, a highly credible poetry critic. To the rest of the participants, the essay writer was identified as a college student. The participants were subsequently allowed to rank the stanzas once again. When T.S. Eliot was ostensibly the communicator, the essay had the most influence on the students when its evaluation of the stanza was most discrepant from theirs, when a fellow student of medium credibility was identified as the essayist. The essay produced a little opinion change when it was slightly discrepant from the opinion of the students, a great deal of change when it was moderately discrepant, and only a little opinion change when it was extremely discrepant. To sum up this section, the conflicting results are accounted for. When a communicator has high credibility, the greater the discrepancy between the view he or she advocates and the view of the audience, the more the audience will be persuaded. On the other hand, when a communicator's credibility is not high, he or she will produce maximum opinion change with moderate discrepancy. Characteristics of the audience. All listeners, readers, or viewers are not alike. Some people are more difficult to persuade. In addition, as we have seen, the kind of communication that appeals to one person may not appeal to another. For example, recall that the level of knowledge audience members possess and their prior opinions will play major roles in determining whether a two-sided communication will be more effective than a one-sided communication. Self-esteem. What effect does an individual's personality have on his or her persuasibility? The one personality variable most consistently related to persuasibility is self-esteem. Individuals who feel inadequate are more easily influenced by a persuasive communication than individuals who think highly of themselves. 53. This seems reasonable enough. After all, if people don't like themselves, then it follows that they don't place a very high premium on their own ideas and have less confidence in their convictions. Consequently, if their ideas are challenged, they may be willing to give them up. Recall that people want to be right. If Sam, who has high self-esteem, listens to a calm, 102 the social animal, communication at variance with his own opinion, he must make up his mind whether he stands a better chance of being right if he changes his opinion or if he stands pat. A person with high self-esteem may experience some conflict when he finds himself in disagreement with a highly credible communicator. He might resolve this conflict by changing his opinion, or he might remain firm. But if Sam had low self-esteem, there would be little or no conflict. Because he doesn't think very highly of himself, he probably believes he stands a better chance of being right if he goes along with the communicator. Political orientation. Anyone who watches cable TV news shows knows that Republicans and Democrats seem to disagree on most issues. After reviewing a vast amount of research on people in the United States and Europe, John Yost and his associates 54 argue that these disagreements reflect a different way of thinking and that conservatives and liberals are not persuaded by the same kinds of arguments. Analyzing the data from 44 years of studies and more than 22,000 people, Yost concludes that relative to liberals, conservatives have a greater psychological need to manage uncertainty and threat. Thus, they are far more moved by arguments that induce fear and cast issues in simple black and white terms. Liberals, on the other hand, tend to respond to more nuanced, fact-based arguments that appeal to reason rather than strong emotions. It is important to stress that these are general tendencies. All of us are moved by fear to some extent, and most of us respond, at least some of the time, to reason. Still, such differences in basic orientation help explain the frustrating fact that liberals and conservatives so infrequently succeed in changing each other's minds. Prior experience of the audience. Another audience-related factor of considerable importance is the frame of mind the audience is in just prior to the communication. An audience can be made receptive to a communication if it has been well fed and is relaxed and happy. Indeed, as Irving Janis and his associates 55 have discovered, people who have been allowed to eat desirable food while reading a persuasive communication are more influenced by what they read than are people in a control group. Similarly, Research by Richard Petty and his colleagues 56 suggests that being in a good mood can make people more vulnerable to persuasion. Jeffrey Cohen and Mass Communication, Propaganda, and Persuasion 103. His colleagues 57 found that people who have recently received self-esteem affirming feedback are also more receptive to persuasive arguments. Conversely, there are ways in which members of an audience can be made less receptive and less persuadable. As I noted, most people predict they will be able to resist persuasive communications such as television commercials. Accordingly, one way of decreasing their persuasibility is by forewarning them that an attempt is going to be made to persuade them. 58 This is especially true if the content of the message differs from their own beliefs. I would argue that the phrase "and now, a message from our sponsor" renders that message less persuasive than it would have been if the communicator had simply glided into it without prologue. The forewarning seems to say, "Watch out, I'm going to try to persuade you," and people tend to respond by marshalling defenses against the message. This phenomenon was demonstrated in an experiment by Jonathan Friedman and David Sears. 59 teenagers were told they would be hearing a talk entitled "Why Teenagers Should Not Be Allowed to Drive." 10 minutes later, the speaker presented them with a prepared communication. In a control condition, the same talk was given without the 10-minute forewarning. The participants in the control condition were more thoroughly convinced by the communication than were those who had been forewarned. People tend to protect their sense of freedom. According to Jack Brem's theory of reactance, 60 when our sense of freedom is threatened, we attempt to restore it. For example, I like to receive birthday presents, but if a borderline student presented me with an expensive birthday present just as I was about to read term papers, I would feel uncomfortable. My sense of freedom or autonomy would be challenged. Similarly, persuasive communications, if blatant or coercive, can be perceived as intruding upon one's freedom of choice, activating one's defenses to resist the messages. For example, if an aggressive salesperson tells me I must buy something, my first reaction is to reassert my independence by leaving the store. In an experiment by Lillian Bensley and Rui Wu, 61 college students watched one of two messages opposed to the drinking of alcoholic beverages. One was a heavy-handed, dogmatic message stating that there was no safe amount of alcohol and that all people should abstain all the time. The second message was a milder one that stressed, 100 for the social animal, the importance of controlling one's drinking. The second message was far more effective in getting people to reduce their consumption of alcohol. This was especially true for heavy drinkers, who almost certainly experienced the most reactance when confronted with the heavy-handed message. Reactance can operate in a number of interesting ways. Suppose that, as I walk down the street, I am gently asked to sign a petition. I don't know much about the issue, and as it is being explained to me, another person accosts us and begins to pressure me not to sign. Reactance theory predicts that, to counteract this pressure and reassert my freedom of choice, I would be more likely to sign. This scenario was actually staged by Madeline Heilman, 62, and the results confirmed her prediction that, under most circumstances, the more intense the attempts to prevent participants from signing the petition, the more likely they were to sign. Of course, as we have seen in this chapter and the preceding one, people can be influenced and do comply with implicit social pressures, as in the Ash experiment. But when those pressures are so blatant that they threaten people's feeling of freedom, they not only resist them, but tend to react in the opposite direction. There is still another aspect of this need for freedom and autonomy that should be mentioned. All other things being equal, when faced with information that runs counter to important beliefs, people have a tendency, whenever feasible, to invent counter-arguments on the spot. 63 In this way, they are able to prevent their opinions from being unduly influenced and protect their sense of autonomy. But it is possible to overcome some of this resistance. Leon Festinger and Nathan Maccabee 64 conducted an experiment in which they attempted to prevent members of their audience from inventing arguments to refute the message being presented to them. This was accomplished by simply distracting the audience somewhat while the communication was being presented. Two groups of students who belonged to a college fraternity were required to listen to a tape-recorded argument about the evils of college fraternities. The argument was erudite, powerful, and, as you might imagine, widely discrepant from their beliefs. During the presentation of the communication, one of the groups was distracted. Specifically, they were shown a highly entertaining silent film. Festinger and Maccabee reasoned that, because this group was engaged in two tasks simultaneously, listening to the tape-recorded, mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion 105, argument against fraternities and watching an entertaining film, their minds would be so occupied they would have little or no opportunity to think up arguments to refute the tape-recorded message. The members of the control group, on the other hand, were not distracted by a film, therefore, they would be better able to devote some of their thoughts to resisting the communication by thinking up counter-arguments. The results of the experiment confirmed this reasoning. The students who were distracted by watching the film underwent substantially more opinion change against fraternities than did those who were not distracted. Let us take a closer look at the other side of the issue. How can we help people to resist attempts to influence them? An elaborate method for inducing such resistance has been developed by William McGuire and his associates. This method has been appropriately dubbed the inoculation effect. We have already seen that a two-sided presentation is more effective for convincing most audiences than a one-sided presentation. Expanding on this phenomenon, McGuire suggested that, if people receive prior exposure to a brief communication that they are then able to refute, they tend to be immunized against a subsequent full-blown presentation of the same argument. In much the same way that a small amount of an attenuated virus immunizes people against a full-blown attack by that virus. In an experiment by McGuire and Dimitri Papagorgis, 65, a group of people stated their opinions. These opinions were then subjected to a mild attack, and the attack was refuted. These people were subsequently subjected to a powerful argument against their initial opinions. Members of this group showed a much smaller tendency to change their opinions than did the members of a control group whose opinions had not been previously subjected to the mild attack. In effect, they had been inoculated against opinion change and made relatively immune. Thus, not only is it often more effective as a propaganda technique to use a two-sided refutational presentation, but if it is used skillfully, such a presentation tends to increase the audience's resistance to subsequent counter-propaganda. In an interesting field experiment, Alfred McAllister and his colleagues 66 inoculated 7th grade students against existing peer pressure to smoke cigarettes. For example, the students were shown advertisements implying that truly liberated women are smokers. "You've come a long way, baby." They were then 106 the social animal, inoculated by being taught that a woman couldn't possibly be liberated if she were hooked on nicotine. Similarly, because many teenagers begin smoking, in part, because it seems cool or tough, peer pressure took the form of being called chicken if one didn't smoke. Accordingly, McAllister set up a situation to counteract that process. The 7th graders role-played a situation in which they practiced countering that argument by saying something like, "I'd be a real chicken if I smoked just to impress you." This inoculation against peer pressure proved to be very effective. By the time the students were in the 9th grade, they were half as likely to smoke as those in a control group from a similar junior high school. Research 67 has found that, in producing resistance, inoculation is most effective when the belief under attack is a cultural truism. A cultural truism is a belief accepted as unquestionably true by most members of a society, like the United States is the most wonderful country in the world, or if people are willing to work hard, they can succeed. Cultural truisms are rarely called into question. Consequently, it is relatively easy for us to lose sight of why we hold those beliefs. Thus, if subjected to a severe attack, these beliefs may crumble. To motivate us to bolster our beliefs, we must be made aware of their vulnerability, and the best way to do this is to be exposed to a mild attack on those beliefs. Prior exposure, in the form of a watered-down attack on our beliefs, produces resistance to later persuasion because we become motivated to defend our beliefs. and we gain some practice in defending these beliefs by being forced to examine why we hold them, we are then better equipped to resist a more serious attack. This is an important point that was frequently ignored or misunderstood by policymakers during the height of the Cold War. For example, in the aftermath of the Korean War, when there was a great deal of fear about the possibility that our prisoners of war had been systematically brainwashed by the Chinese communists, a Senate committee recommended that, to build resistance among our young people to brainwashing and other forms of communist propaganda, courses on patriotism and Americanism should be instituted in our public school system, but my reading of the research on inoculation led me to an entirely different conclusion. Specifically, I asserted that the best way to help people resist anti-democratic propaganda would be to challenge their belief in democracy, and the best way to build mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion 107. Resistance to one-sided communist propaganda would be to teach fair, even-handed courses on communism in high schools. 68 At the height of the Cold War, such a suggestion was undoubtedly considered subversive by those politicians who were terrified at the prospect of our young people learning anything positive about communism. The fear was that this would make them more vulnerable to propaganda, but historical events have supported the social psychological research findings that, if one wants to mitigate the impact of simplistic propaganda, there is no substitute for free inquiry into ideas of all kinds. The person who is easiest to brainwash is the person whose beliefs are based on slogans that have never been seriously challenged. Opinions versus attitudes. How easy is it to persuade a person? The answer depends in part on whether we are dealing with opinions or attitudes. The term opinion, which has been used throughout this chapter, is what a person believes to be factually true. Thus, it is my opinion that eating vegetables is good for me, that wearing seat belts reduces traffic fatalities, and that New York City is hot in the summer. Such opinions are primarily cognitive, that is, they take place in the head rather than in the gut. They are also transient, they can be changed by good, clear evidence to the contrary. Thus, if longtime consumer advocate Ralph Nader presented me with data indicating that seat belts, as they are currently constructed, do not reduce fatalities significantly, it is likely that I would change my opinion on that issue. On the other hand, suppose a person holds the opinion that Jews engage in sharp business practices, or that Asians are sneaky, or that old people are a drain on society, or that the United States of America is the greatest country in the history of the world, or that New York City is a jungle. How do these opinions differ from the ones stated in the preceding paragraph? They tend to be both emotional and evaluative, that is, they imply likes or dislikes. Believing Asians are sneaky implies that the person doesn't like Asians. The opinion that New York City is a jungle is different from the opinion that New York City is hot in the summer. The opinion that New York City is a jungle is not simply cognitive, it carries with it a negative evaluation and some degree of fear or anxiety. An opinion that 108 The social animal includes an evaluative and an emotional component is called an attitude. Compared with opinions, attitudes are extremely difficult to change. Suppose Sam is an ardent and careful consumer who is deeply concerned about matters of health. Over the years, he has come to trust Ralph Nader's research on many issues, including unsafe cars, cholesterol in hot dogs, hazardous electrical appliances, air pollution, and so on. But, further, suppose Sam happens to be a white supremacist who believes that the white race is intellectually superior to all other races. What if Nader conducted an exhaustive study indicating that, when given culture-free intelligence tests, racial minorities score as high as whites? Would this information be likely to change Sam's attitude? Probably not. How come? Doesn't Sam regard Nader as a careful researcher? It is my guess that, because the issue is rooted in emotion, Nader's findings about intelligence testing would not influence Sam as easily or as thoroughly as Nader's findings about cars, cholesterol, or pollution. Attitudes are harder to change than simple opinions. Effects of TV watching. The sheer volume of television we Americans consume is staggering. 69. The typical household's television set is on for more than 7 hours a day, 70, and the average American watches 30 hours of television a week. That's a little more than 1,500 hours a year. The average high school graduate has spent much more time watching television than interacting with his or her parents or with teachers. 71. The medium has impact, and the view of reality it transmits seldom remains value-free. George Gerbner and his associates 72 conducted the most extensive analyses of television yet. Since the late 1960s, these researchers have been analyzing thousands of primetime television programs and characters. Their findings, taken as a whole, suggest that television's representation of reality has traditionally misled American viewers. In primetime programming in the 1960s and 1970s, for example, men outnumbered women by almost 3-to-1, and women were depicted as younger and less experienced than men. Non-whites and the elderly were vastly underrepresented, and members of minority groups were disproportionately cast in minor roles. Moreover, most mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion 109 primetime characters were portrayed as professional and managerial workers. Although 67% of the workforce in the United States was employed in a blue-collar or a service job, only 25% of television characters held such jobs. Finally, crime, then as now, was at least 10 times as prevalent on television as in real life. About half of television's characters are involved in a violent confrontation each week. In reality, less than 1% of Americans are victims of criminal violence in any given year. FBI statistics reveal that, during the past several years, the rate of violent crime has steadily decreased in this country, but on TV, violent crime is on the increase. David Rentels, 73, a television writer and former president of the Writers Guild of America, summed it up best when he said, "From 8 to 11 o'clock each night, television is one long lie, and people believe the lie." Research conducted during this era compared the attitudes and beliefs of heavy viewers and light viewers. They found that heavy viewers expressed more racially prejudiced attitudes, overestimated the number of people employed as physicians, lawyers, and athletes, perceived women as having more limited abilities and interests than men, held exaggerated views about the prevalence of violence. Perhaps most troubling, research continually shows that the more television you watch, the more you see the world as a sinister place, where people are just looking out for themselves and would take advantage of you if they had a chance. In other words, reality, to the heavy viewer, is like a typical reality show. These attitudes and beliefs reflect the inaccurate portrayals of American life provided to us by television. Given the dark side of human nature portrayed on TV, it is not so surprising that heavy viewers report being less happy than do light viewers. 74. For most of us, television is virtually our only vivid source of information about some aspects of society. Take crime, for example. A major portion of television programming consists of crime shows. The average 15-year-old has viewed more than 13,000 television killings. Moreover, several studies have shown that crime dramas dispense remarkably consistent images of both the police and criminals. For example, on TV, police officers are amazingly effective, solving almost every crime, and are infallible in one regard: the wrong person is almost never in jail at the end of a show. Television fosters an illusion of certainty in crime fighting. Television criminals generally turn 110 the social animal to crime because of psychopathology or insatiable greed. Television emphasizes criminals' personal responsibility for their actions and largely ignores situational pressures correlated with crime, such as poverty and unemployment. This portrayal has important social consequences. People who watch a lot of television come to adopt this belief system, which affects their expectations and can cause them to take a hardline stance when serving on juries. Heavy viewers are likely to reverse the presumption of innocence, believing that defendants must be guilty of something, otherwise, they wouldn't have been brought to trial. 75. The history of television shows that as TV became available to people in a particular region of the country, It coincided with a sharp rise in larceny in that area. 76. Why should this be the case? The most reasonable explanation is that television promotes the consumption of goods through advertisements. It also depicts upper and middle-class lifestyles as the norm. This illusion of widespread wealth and consumption may frustrate and anger deprived viewers who compare their lifestyles with those portrayed on television, thereby motivating them to share in the American dream any way they can. I must urge a bit of caution in interpreting the research on the effects of television. Unlike the experiments described earlier, the TV research is correlational. The amount of TV viewing is measured along with some other variable, happiness, attitudes toward crime, beliefs about crime, and so on. It is nearly impossible to specify the direction of the relationship. For example, it seems reasonable to assume that people who watch a lot of TV would become less happy as a result. But it is also possible that unhappiness causes people to choose to watch large amounts of TV. Human thinking is not always logical. Although we humans are capable of accurate and subtle thinking, we are equally capable of distortions and great sloppiness in our thought processes. To understand how to change attitudes, first it is essential to understand the complexities of human thinking, as well as the motives that lead people to resist change. These are interesting and important issues that I will explore in the next 2 chapters. Chapter 4 is an attempt to understand how people construe and misconstrue social events. Chapter 5 is a description of the major motives underlying construal and misconstrual, mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. 111. Saul Steinberg, Untitled Drawing, Ink on Paper. Originally published in The New Yorker, August 29, 1953. Copyright The Saul Steinberg Foundation, Artists' Rights Society, New York. 4. Social Cognition. In his masterpiece, Public Opinion, the distinguished political analyst Walter Lippmann recounts the story of a young girl, brought up in a small mining town, who one day went from cheerfulness into a deep spasm of grief. It seems that a gust of wind had suddenly cracked a kitchen window pane. The young girl was inconsolable and spoke incomprehensibly for hours. When she was finally able to speak rationally, she explained that a broken pane of glass meant that a close relative had died. She was therefore mourning her father, whom she was convinced had just passed away. The young girl remained disconsolate until, days later, a telegram arrived verifying that her father was still very much alive. The girl had constructed a complete fiction based on a simple external fact, a superstition, fear, and love for her father. In the Middle Ages, it was common practice for Europeans to empty chamber pots, containers that stored a day's worth of urine and excrement, by throwing the contents out the window onto the street below. The waste matter would remain in the street, breeding pestilence and disease. To the modern mind, the practice seems primitive, barbaric, and downright stupid, especially when one considers that the ancient Romans had developed indoor plumbing. So how did the chamber pot come into being? During the Middle Ages, people came to believe that not only was nudity sinful but that an unclothed body was subject to attack by evil spirits. Because of that, I am grateful to Anthony Pratcanis for helping to draft the first version of this chapter. Belief. The Roman practice of daily bathing was abandoned throughout Europe and replaced by a once-a-year bath. Eventually, the indoor baths fell into disrepair and society lost the plumbing skills needed to maintain indoor toilets. The chamber pot was born of necessity. It was centuries later that the spirit theory of disease was replaced by our modern theory based on viruses and bacteria. My point here is not to explore the inner workings of the abnormal mind, nor to describe modern advances in health and hygiene. Instead, I tell these stories to raise a fundamental question. To what extent do we moderns behave like the young girl from the mining town and the users of the medieval chamber pot? How might our fictions guide our behavior and actions? It would not surprise me if the writer of a social psychology textbook in the 22nd century began the chapter on social cognition not with a story about chamber pots, but with a tale of pesticide runoff or deaths due to the AIDS virus. The story might go something like this. During the 20th and 21st centuries, millions died of famine, not from lack of food, but because their food had been poisoned by years of chemical runoff gradually building up in the food chain. A great many knowledgeable people suspected this was happening, but, unaccountably, little or nothing was done to prevent it. In addition, more than 150 million people died of the AIDS virus because they were unwilling to protect themselves by using condoms. The modern reader may be wondering how a culture that could place men and women on the moon and cure a plethora of dangerous diseases could behave so foolishly. Well, it seems that, in those days, many people apparently believed that talking frankly about the operation of their sexual parts was sinful and could cause harm. For example, at the turn of the 21st century, most parents of teenagers clung to the primitive belief that distributing condoms in high school would increase sexual promiscuity, in spite of the fact that careful research demonstrated that this was not the case. My point in relating these stories is not, however, to point out how simple-minded most people were in the 20th and 21st centuries, but to ask a more fundamental question: how much are we like those heedless AIDS victims or those farmers who used pesticides so carelessly? 114. The social animal. Every generation looks back in amazement at the incorrect, irrational, and sometimes backward thinking of previous generations. Social psychologists spend a great deal of time examining the underlying reasons why people of every generation think the way they do about the world, and why everyday thinking, explaining, predicting, and deciding, frequently is irrational. We call this subfield of social psychology social cognition, and as you will see, despite the fact that we humans are the most intelligent and successful species on the planet, we are remarkably prone to error. Our errors, however, are not just stupid, random mistakes. Often they reflect systematic biases or errors that are like bugs in a computer program. Sometimes the program works when we are trying to accomplish one thing, but fails us when we try to do another. As such, the study of errors can tell us a good deal about the way our minds are programmed. Our minds are frequently at work trying to making sense of the world. How we do it makes a difference. Whenever we meet a new person, we form a first impression. Every time we enter a supermarket, we walk down an aisle lined with hundreds of products. We must attempt to discern which will best suit our needs. Occasionally, someone will ask us a question about ourselves, and we must think back over the bits and pieces of our lives to construct answers we believe to be accurate. Every day we make decisions: what to wear, with whom to eat lunch, what to eat, which movie to see, whether to answer the telephone. Occasionally, our decisions are of great importance: whom to trust, what subject to major in, what profession to follow, which social policy to support, which person to marry, whether to have children, and so on. How we make both trivial and important decisions depends on how we make sense of our social world. How do we make sense of the world? We humans have powerful and efficient brains. But wonderful as they are far from perfect. One consequence of this imperfection is that most of us end up knowing a lot of things that simply are not true. Let us take a common example. Many people harbor the belief that relatively infertile couples who adopt a baby are subsequently more likely to conceive a child of their own than relatively infertile couples who do not adopt. The reasoning goes something, social cognition 115, like this: after the adoption, the pressure is off. Now that the couple is relaxed, this somehow makes conception easier. But according to Tom Gilovich, this belief, although widespread, is simply not true. Relatively infertile couples who adopt a baby are no more likely to conceive than relatively infertile couples who do not adopt. Why do most people believe it is so? 2 reasons: it is such a charming and comforting idea that we want it to be true. And we tend to focus our attention on those few instances when adoptive parents later conceived a baby of their own and not on those instances when they failed to conceive or when non-adoptive parents conceived a baby. Thus, because of selective attention and selective memory, it sure seems to be true. Are we rational animals? It is clear that we mostly try to be. One long-standing and widespread view of human cognition is that it is completely rational. Each individual attempts to do his or her best to be right and to hold correct opinions and beliefs. One of the primary proponents of this view of human thought was the 18th and 19th century utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who wrote about the way people determine the goodness, or moral status of their behavior or decisions. According to Bentham, we engage in a philosophic calculus, or happiness calculation, to determine what is good and what is bad. To take a mundane example, suppose I wanted to purchase a new car. In determining the make and model to buy, I would add up the pleasures each brand would bring and subtract the pain. I then select the car that brings me the most pleasure with the least amount of pain. For Bentham, it was the role of governments and economic systems to ensure the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Others agreed. Bentham's concept of philosophic calculus became, with some revision and expansion from his student John Stuart Mill, one of the foundational ideas of modern capitalism. Much more recently, in the 1960s and 70s, the social psychologist Harold Kelly advanced a more complex but similarly rational portrait of human thought. People, he argued, think like naive scientists. To arrive at the best explanation for a given event or phenomenon, professional scientists look for certain relationships in their data, that is, they attempt to find cases in which X came before Y and always varied with Y and only with Y to conclude that X caused 116 the social animal, Y. So, for example, if a scientist wanted to determine if smoking causes lung cancer, she might consider all the people who smoke and get lung cancer, all the people who smoke and don't get lung cancer, all the people who don't smoke and get lung cancer, and all the people who don't smoke and don't get lung cancer. In this way, the scientist can consider the role of smoking in producing lung cancer. Kelly suggested a similar process when an ordinary person attempts to explain someone else's behavior, the attribution process. Specifically, the person looks for three pieces of information: the consistency of the actor's behavior, consensus, and/or the distinctiveness of the action. For example, suppose you see Beth kiss Scott and someone asks you why. According to Kelly, before you could give a reasonable answer to that question, you would want to know a bit more about the situation. Does Beth go around kissing almost everyone at the drop of a hat? If so, Beth's consistency would probably lead you to conclude that the reason Beth kissed Scott is that Beth is a very affectionate person. But suppose you found out that almost everybody kisses Scott. The consensus would suggest that the reason Beth kissed Scott is that Scott is a very kissable person who everybody likes. Finally, if Beth kisses only Scott and no one else kisses Scott, the distinctiveness of the kissing is due to some special relationship between Beth and Scott. Either they are in love or Scott has done something especially deserving of a kiss. The way we use information to make attributions can underlie far more important decisions than determining why one person kisses another. Teachers must decide why students fail, juries must decide innocence or guilt. Nations must decide how to respond to the provocations of other nations. In all such cases, a systematic weighing of consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness information can be highly valuable and extraordinarily important. But do people really think this way? Are we as rational as Bentham and Kelly suggest we are? There is little doubt that we are capable of such behavior. For example, Benjamin Franklin reports that he routinely performed a philosophic calculation by writing down the pros and cons for major decisions. There are times when many of us, Social Cognition 117, behave in the same way, as when purchasing a new car or deciding which college to attend. And the ease with which you could generate conclusions about Beth and Scott when given the appropriate covariation information indicates that it is at least possible to think like a scientist. However, rational thought requires at least two conditions: the thinker has access to accurate, useful information, and the thinker has the mental resources needed to process life's data. These conditions almost never hold in everyday life. We do not possess a God's eye view of the world, a perspective that is all-knowing and free from bias. Consider something as simple as my car purchase. I probably do not know all the facts. If it's a new model, long-term repair data simply do not exist. Furthermore, my view of the car is bounded by my own limited perspective. I hear about the car primarily from advertisers, who are motivated to exaggerate its positive features. I have limited experience with the car, a 10-minute dealer-supervised test drive as opposed to long-term driving in all kinds of hazardous road and weather conditions. If something as common as a new car purchase can be fraught with missing and misleading information, imagine the difficulty when it comes to making more unusual decisions, such as when to go to war, whom to marry, or how to spend tax money. Moreover, even if the data were available, I simply do not have the leisure time or the motivation to devote to a full-scale analysis of every problem I encounter. Suppose I go ahead and make a philosophic calculation on which car to purchase, and it takes about 5 hours of research and weighing of alternatives. In the meantime, a dozen other decisions need to be made. What shall I do for lunch? How should I revise my lecture notes? Which job candidate is best to hire? Does my daughter really need those expensive braces on her teeth? Am I to spend several precious hours listing the pros and cons on each of these decisions while dozens of upcoming decisions are postponed? We live in a message-dense, decision-rich environment. The average American will see more than 7 million advertisements in his or her lifetime and will need to make countless decisions every day, some important, some trivial, some seemingly trivial but with important consequences. It is impossible to think deeply about each and every piece of information that comes our way and about each and every decision that must be made. 118 The social animal. What do we do? As you might guess, we try to use shortcuts whenever we can. According to Susan Fiske and Shelley Taylor, we humans are programmed to be cognitive misers. We are always looking for ways to conserve cognitive energy. Our capacity to process information is limited, so we attempt to adopt strategies that simplify complex problems. We accomplish this by ignoring some information to reduce our cognitive load, or we overuse other information to keep from having to search for more, or we may go with our gut and accept a less than perfect alternative because it is almost good enough, rather than thinking through all the angles. The strategies of the cognitive miser may be efficient, making fairly good use of our limited cognitive capacity to process a nearly infinite world of information, but these strategies can also lead to serious errors and biases, especially when we select an inappropriate shortcut or, in our rush to move on, we ignore a vital piece of information. Some readers may be disheartened to find that they are not as rational or as thorough in their thinking as they might have supposed. It is exciting to believe that the human mind has unlimited power or that we have a personal pipeline to absolute, objective truth, but, disheartened or not, it is critical to realize that our shortcuts can produce biases and prejudices that obscure the truth. Emily Pronin and her colleagues have shown that one of the most pervasive biases is that we think we are less biased than the average person. We feel that we see the world as it is, while others see the world as they want to see it. We have this bias blind spot, Pronin argues, because when we introspect about our motivations and thought processes to ask ourselves if we are misjudging, we are unable to detect biases at work because the nature of our cognitive biases is that they are unconscious and unintentional. In contrast, when we judge others, we observe their behavior, and much of the time we can find what looks like bias. Yet unless we recognize our cognitive limitations, we will be enslaved by them. For example, if we fail to recognize that we often judge others on the basis of stereotypes or that the specific manner in which a piece of information is presented can bias our judgments, we will be unable to take steps to prevent or correct such errors. Worse yet, if we fail to understand the consequences of being cognitive misers, we are more prone to confuse our own interpretations of things with absolute truth and assume that those who don't share our perspective are misguided, stupid, crazy, or evil. Social Cognition 119. As history demonstrates, it becomes easier for people to commit acts of hatred and cruelty if they are certain that they are absolutely right and others are wrong. 11. Our propensity for bias and error, then, can be a significant barrier to interpersonal and intergroup understanding. Yet the fact that we are cognitive misers and have blind spots about our own unconscious biases does not mean we are doomed to distort, Once we know some of the limitations and common biases of the human mind, we can begin to think a little better and make smarter decisions. It is my purpose in this chapter to do more than list some of these limitations of our thinking. Rather, by exploring these limitations, I hope that we can learn to think a little more clearly. The effects of context on social judgment. Let's begin by looking at how the social context, the way things are presented and described, affects our judgments about people, including ourselves. We will take, in turn, 4 different aspects of the social context: the comparison of alternatives, the thoughts primed by a situation, how a decision is framed or posed, and the way information is presented. As we do so, a basic principle of social thinking should emerge. All judgment is relative. How we think about a person or thing is dependent on its surrounding context, reference points, and contrast effects. An object can appear to be better or worse than it is, depending on what we compare it with. Most salespeople implicitly understand this phenomenon. Some act on it. Let me illustrate by taking you house shopping with a real estate agent. After determining your needs, the agent drives you to some homes you might find interesting. The first stop is a tiny 2-bedroom house sitting on a smallish lot. The house needs a new coat of paint, the interior is in disarray, the linoleum in the kitchen is buckling, the living room carpet is worn and smells bad, the master bedroom is so small that an average-sized bedroom suite simply won't fit. When the realtor tells you the asking price, you are stunned. Holy cow! They want that much for this place? Who'd be dumb enough to pay so much for this shack? Certainly not you, and probably not anyone else. But how do you suppose viewing that 120 the social animal, dilapidated house might influence your evaluation of the average-looking house you are shown next? In a sense, the dilapidated house is a decoy, and decoys can exercise a powerful impact on our decisions, by influencing the way the alternatives look. On most restaurant wine lists, you will typically find a wide price range for each variety of wine. For example, let's say there are 4 Merlots, a $14 bottle, a $35 bottle, a $70 bottle, and a $170 bottle. The restaurant may not sell much of the $170 wine, but it's still worth it for them to keep it in stock. Why? Because its existence makes the other wines look cheaper by comparison, and because most people don't want to feel cheap by ordering the least expensive bottle on the list. The strategic placement of the outrageously pricey decoy allows the restaurant to jack up the price of the second and third cheapest bottles, charging you a good deal more than they are worth. The principle behind the use of such decoys is called the contrast effect. In contrast to the overpriced shack, the average-looking house with the average price is a great find. In contrast to a $170 bottle of wine, the ordinarily pricey $70 bottle seems just right. When any object is contrasted with something similar but not as good, that particular object is judged to be better, prettier, taller, or a better bargain than would normally be the case. If a man of normal height is in the company of midgets, he seems very tall. If he is a member of a professional basketball team, he seems very short. In the 1970s, a young basketball player named Nate "Tiny" Archibald was a staple for the Boston Celtics. Would it surprise you to learn that Tiny stood 6 feet 1 inch tall? In Jonathan Swift's classic novel Gulliver's Travels, the hero, a man of normal height, was considered a giant when traveling among the residents of Lilliput, a dwarf when traveling among the residents of Brobdingnag. This is the contrast effect. One of the most striking examples of the contrast effect was produced in an experiment by Douglas Kenrick and Sari Gutierrez, 12, who asked male college students to rate the attractiveness of a potential blind date before or after watching an episode of the television show Charlie's Angels, which was popular in the 1970s. The males rated their blind date, social cognition 121, as far less attractive after they saw the show than before. The Angels provided a stringent context for rating attractiveness. Almost anyone would suffer by contrast. In a follow-up study, married men exposed to pictures of attractive female models indicated on subsequent questionnaires that they were less in love with their wives than did men in a control group who instead of saw pictures of modern art. 13. Contrast effects can be strategically used to great effect. A used car dealer may place an old clunker on the lot to improve the appearance of the autos in its immediate vicinity. A presidential candidate may select a vice presidential running mate of lesser stature to enhance the positive perception of his or her own presidential qualities. Infomercials frequently compare the new gizmo they are selling to clearly inferior gizmos. And that dilapidated house the realtor showed you? You'll never buy it, but it's guaranteed to make all the other houses you see next look like a better deal. The lesson to be learned from research on contrast effects is that the selection of comparisons makes a difference. Depending on the context, objects and alternatives can be made to look better or worse. Often we do not pay much attention to the influence of context, much less question the validity of the alternatives presented. This greatly enhances the power of context makers, such as politicians, advertisers, journalists, and sales agents. The context they create influences our perceptions and judgments, lulling us into decisions that we might not otherwise make. Important judgments we make about ourselves can also be powerfully influenced by contrast effects. For example, many high school valedictorians experience a dip in self-esteem when they arrive at an elite college to find themselves surrounded by other former high school valedictorians. No longer the smartest kid around, they can feel stupid merely by being average. 14 Similarly, research has shown that, when people are exposed to images of beautiful people, they will rate themselves as less attractive than those shown images of more average-looking people. 15. Priming and construct accessibility. One of the standard comedic devices on television sitcoms is the double entendre. A typical double entendre goes like this. Early in the show, the teenage daughter tells everyone but her father that she made the school's 122 the social animal, co-ed softball team as the starting catcher. At the same time, her father finds out about a big party sponsored by some of his daughter's classmates that promises to have some wild goings-on and just happens to be scheduled on the same night as the softball game. The climactic scene involves the father overhearing his innocent daughter telling her friend about a pitcher. "Boy, I can hardly wait for tonight, I am so excited. I've never played with Tommy before. I love his technique, if he tries, I know he can go all the way. Tommy has wonderful stuff." The father is outraged and storms out of the house to intercept his young daughter. The audience is entertained because they know what is happening. The father thinks his daughter is talking about sex when she is really discussing softball. The double entendre of the sitcom illustrates an important principle of social cognition. How we interpret social events usually depends on what we are currently thinking about, as well as what beliefs and categories we typically use to make sense of things. The categories we use to interpret the world can vary with the individual. Some people see the world through rose-colored glasses, whereas others see it in hostile or depressive terms. Our interpretation can also depend on what happens to be prominent in the situation, and what is prominent can be induced through priming, a procedure based on the notion that ideas that have been recently encountered or frequently activated are more likely to come to mind and thus will be used in interpreting social events. A study by Tori Higgins, William Rolls, and Carl Jones illustrates the role of priming in the formation of impressions about other people. 16 In this experiment, subjects were asked to participate in two different research projects, one on perception and one on reading comprehension. The first experiment served to prime different trait categories. Some of the subjects were asked to remember positive trait words, whereas the others were asked to remember negative trait words. 5 minutes later, as part of the reading comprehension study, subjects then read an ambiguous paragraph about a fictitious person named Donald. The paragraph described a number of behaviors performed by Donald that could be interpreted as either adventurous or reckless, self-confident or conceited, independent or aloof, and social cognition. 123, persistent or stubborn. The subjects then described Donald in their own words and rated how desirable they considered him to be. The results showed that how they were primed influenced their impressions of Donald. When negative trait categories had been primed, they characterized Donald in negative terms and saw him as less desirable than when positive categories had been primed. Thus, cues too subtle for us to consciously notice can color our judgments about other people's behavior. But can such cues affect our own behavior? Apparently so. John Barg and his associates 17 have conducted studies showing surprisingly strong effects of exposure to words on behavior. In one study, participants unscrambled jumbled up words and were told to go get the experimenter in the next room when they were finished. Unbeknownst to the participants, the anagram task exposed them to different kinds of words. Some participants saw words related to rudeness, whereas others saw more neutral words. Later, when it was time to fetch the experimenter, the participants found him in the hallway deeply engaged in a conversation with another person. Compared with the participants primed with neutral words, those who had seen words associated with rudeness were far more likely to interrupt the conversation. In a similar study, 18 after being primed with words either consistent with the stereotype of old people or with unrelated words, participants were observed walking down the hallway away from the experiment. Those primed with the elderly stereotype walked significantly more slowly, like the old people they were primed to think about. For brief periods, at least, we can become whomever or whatever pops into our mind. Priming can and does have a major impact on the attitudes and behavior of many people, even of seasoned professionals in life and death situations in the real world. For example, consider experienced physicians who work with AIDS patients. One might imagine that they would have a clear, solid idea about their own risk of infection. Linda Heath and her colleagues 19 found that this is not necessarily the case. They asked several hundred physicians about their perceived risk of contracting HIV on the job. For one group of physicians, Heath primed their thoughts about the danger by getting them to imagine they're being exposed to the virus while doing 124 The Social Animal, their work. The assessment of risk by these physicians was deeply affected by the priming. Specifically, those physicians who were instructed to imagine themselves being exposed to HIV on the job subsequently felt that there was a significantly higher risk of their being infected than did those who were not primed. This was true regardless of the extent of the physician's actual experiences with HIV-infected patients. Let us look at priming in the mass media. Several studies have shown that there is a link between the stories the media choose to cover and those the viewers consider to be the most important issues of the day. 20 In other words, the mass media make certain issues and concepts readily accessible and thereby set the public's political and social agendas. To take one example, in a pioneering study of an election in North Carolina, Maxwell McCombs and Donald Shaw 21 found that the issues voters came to consider most important in the campaign coincided precisely with the amount of coverage of those issues in the local media. In a similar vein, vast numbers of heterosexuals first became deeply concerned about the dangers of AIDS immediately following the extensive media coverage of basketball superstar Magic Johnson's announcement that he was HIV positive. 22. In an interesting series of experiments, the political psychologists Shanto Iyengar, Mark Peters, and Donald Kinder demonstrated the importance of priming on the relationship between repeated media exposure and issue importance. 23 In one experiment, the researchers edited the evening news so that participants received a steady dose of news reports about a specific problem facing the United States. For example, some participants watched reports of the weaknesses of U.S. defense capabilities, others watched reports emphasizing pollution concerns, a third group watched accounts of inflation and economic matters. The results were clear. After a week of viewing the edited programs, participants emerged from the experiment convinced that the target problem, the one primed by extensive coverage in the programs they watched, was more important for the country to solve than they did before viewing the programs. What's more, the research participants acted on their newfound perceptions, evaluating the president's performance on the basis of how he handled the target problem, and were more positively disposed toward candidates, Social Cognition 125, who stated strong positions on those issues. As the political scientist Bernard Cohen 24 observed, the mass media may not be successful much of the time in telling people what to think, but it is stunningly successful in telling its readers what to think about. The world will look different to different people, depending on the map that is drawn for them by the writers, editors, and publishers of the papers they read. Framing the decision. Another factor that influences how we construct our social world is decision framing. Whether a problem or decision is presented in such a way that it appears to represent the potential for a loss or for a gain. To illustrate the power of decision framing, let's imagine that you are the President of the United States and the country is bracing itself for the outbreak of an unusual epidemic expected to kill 600 people. Your top advisors have prepared 2 alternative programs to combat the disease and have estimated, to the best of their ability, the likely consequences of adopting each program. If Program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If Program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. Ms. or Mr. President, which program do you favor? Please think about this carefully and answer before you read on. If you are like most of the subjects in an experiment performed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, 25, you would select Program A. You might think to yourself, Program A guarantees that 200 people will be saved, and Program B gambles the lives of these people for only a 1 in 3 chance that we could save more lives. But suppose your advisors had asked for your judgment in a different manner. Suppose they presented the problem this way. If Program A is adopted, 400 people will die. If Program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. 126. The social animal, which program would you favor? Please think about this carefully and answer the question before reading more. The 2 options are functionally identical. In both versions, Program A means that 200 people will live and 400 will die. Program B results in a 1/3 chance that no one will die and 600 people will live and a 2/3 chance that no one will be saved and 600 people will die. But for most people, their decision-making process about the epidemic is now quite different. They think, if I go with Program A, 400 people will surely die. I might as well gamble on B. When asked in this second manner, 78% of Kahneman and Tversky's subjects favored Program B. Why did such a simple rewording of the options produce such a drastic switch in answers? Kahneman and Tversky have noted that people dislike losses and seek to avoid them. It is more painful to give up $20 than it is pleasurable to gain $20. Your advisors framed the first policy decision so that Program B looked like the bigger loss. In the second version, your advisors framed it so that Program A looked like a sure loss. How the question is framed is of enormous importance, but this is just an imaginary event. It is a hypothetical situation. Surely such a simple rewording of a request cannot influence real behavior, right? Don't bet on it. In an experiment I did in collaboration with 2 of my students, Marty Gonzalez and Mark Costanzo, we showed that framing can play a major role in determining whether people are willing to commit several $100s to insulate their homes to conserve energy. 26. In one condition, after examining each home, energy experts gave each homeowner a detailed, individualized description of how much money they could save each year on heating bills. In the other condition, auditors were trained to frame the description in terms of loss, that is, they provided the same information but informed the homeowners that they were losing money every day, that it was akin to throwing money out the window. Homeowners in the loss condition were twice as likely to invest the money to insulate their homes as those in the save condition. Let's look at the prevention of breast cancer. Breast cancer poses a serious health threat for many women. Fortunately, early detection and diagnosis of breast cancer can greatly improve a woman's chances of surviving the disease. However, one of the best methods for Social Cognition 127, detecting breast cancer, a monthly breast self-examination, is not performed regularly by the vast majority of women. Beth Meyerowitz and Shelley Chaikin 27 developed and distributed 3 pamphlets designed to increase routine breast self-examination by women. One pamphlet contained only information concerning the need to perform self-examinations and how to do them. The second pamphlet contained this information plus arguments emphasizing the positive consequences of self-examination. The third pamphlet stressed the negative consequences of failing to perform a self-examination. Meyerowitz and Chaikin found that, 4 months after reading the pamphlet, only those women who received the pamphlet stressing the negative consequences were significantly more likely to perform breast self-examination. How you frame a decision can make a big difference, even in a life-and-death situation. The ordering of information. Another factor that influences the way we organize and interpret the social world is the manner in which information is arranged and distributed. Let's look at 2 characteristics of the way information is presented and their effects on social judgment: what comes first, and the amount of information given. The primacy effect and impression formation. In the preceding chapter, we discussed the order of presentation for persuasive arguments, that is, in a debate, the conditions under which it is more effective to state one's arguments first or last. When it comes to forming impressions of other people, however, there is not much of a contest, with few exceptions. The old saw "put your best foot forward" turns out to be accurate. The things we learn first about a person have a decisive impact on our judgment of that person. In a pioneering experiment, Solomon Asch 28 demonstrated the power of the primacy effect in impression formation. In Asch's study, subjects received descriptive sentences such as the following and then were asked to rate the person described in each sentence. 128. The social animal. A. Steve is intelligent, industrious, impulsive, critical, stubborn, and envious. B. Steve is envious, stubborn, critical, impulsive, industrious, and intelligent. Note that the 2 sentences contain exactly the same information about Steve. However, sentence puts the positive traits first, whereas sentence puts them last. Asch found that Steve was rated more positively when he was described by sentence than by sentence, a primacy effect. Asch's original finding has been repeated many times in many ways. For example, in experiments by Edward Jones and his colleagues, 29 research participants observed another individual performing a series of 30 intelligence test items. In each case, the person answered 15 of the 30 questions correctly. However, sometimes the person started out hot, that is, answering a lot of questions correctly at the beginning, and then declined in performance. At other times, the person started out slow, answering few questions correctly at first, and then finished with a bang, answering most of the final items. Who was perceived as most intelligent? As one might expect based on what we know about the primacy effect, the individual who started out hot was seen as more intelligent than the late bloomer, despite the fact that both answered the same number of questions correctly. In many situations we are not simply observing those we are judging, we are interacting and actively influencing them, and we have specific goals that shape our interpretations of the people with whom we interact. For example, teachers often judge the intelligence of their students, but they have a hand in teaching and influencing those performances upon which they will base their judgments. Thus, an interesting exception to the primacy effect was discovered in an experiment by Joshua Aronson and Edward Jones. 30 In this study, subjects tutored performers who were trying to solve a set of anagrams. Half the subjects were promised a reward if they could raise their students' scores. The remaining subjects were promised a reward for improving their students' enduring ability to solve anagrams, so that they would do better on anagram tasks in the future. During the tutoring session, the students' performances, which were prearranged by the experimenter, followed the pattern of the Jones, Social Cognition 129, experiment cited above, that is, half of the students performed extremely well to start and then their performance declined, others started slow and then improved. The sum total was identical, only the order differed. Those subjects who were motivated to maximize the performance of their students rated them as more intelligent when their early performance was good. This is the primacy effect. They wanted to help their students to do well and, after the first few trials, concluded that their students were intelligent, regardless of their later performance. But those subjects who were motivated to improve the ability of their students to solve anagrams rated as more intelligent those who started poorly but ended up doing well. In other words, they were more impressed with increases in performance than with a fast start. This suggests that if teachers are invested in the long-term development of their students, they will resist making a snap judgment based on a first impression. Although the results of the Aronson and Jones experiment demonstrate the complexity of the phenomenon, it is an interesting exception to the general rule, with few exceptions. Informing impressions of people. What mother told us was right. First impressions matter a great deal. Why does the primacy effect in impression formation occur? Researchers have found evidence for two explanations, either of which can be true, depending on the circumstances. According to the attention decrement explanation, the later items in the list receive less attention as the observers tire and their minds start to wander. Thus, these items have less impact on judgment. According to the interpretive set explanation, the first items serve to create an initial impression that then is used to interpret subsequent information, either through the discounting of incongruent facts or by subtle changes in the meaning of the words further down the list. Regardless of the explanation, the primacy effect has an important impact on social judgment. Moreover, we usually have little control over the order in which we receive information, whether that information is from a television news show or from our every 130 the social animal day observations of friends and neighbors. Therefore, it is important to realize the existence of these effects so that we can try to correct for them. The amount of information when pondering a difficult decision. A common plea is often heard, if I only had more information. Although having more information may sometimes be helpful, it can also change how an object is perceived and evaluated through what is called the dilution effect, the tendency for neutral and irrelevant information to weaken a judgment or impression. Consider this example, taken from an experiment by Henry Zuckier. 31 Which student has the higher grade point average? Tim spends about 31 hours studying outside of class in an average week. Tom spends about 31 hours studying outside of class in an average week. Tom has one brother and two sisters. He visits his grandparents about once every 3 months. He once went on a blind date and shoots pool about once every 2 months. If you are similar to the students in Zuckier's study, you would believe that Tim is smarter than Tom. Zuckier found that including irrelevant and non-diagnostic information that has nothing to do with the issue at hand can dilute, that is, make less potent, the impact of relevant information. The dilution effect has obvious practical value for persons interested in managing impressions, such as those in sales or politics. Advertisers know that including weak or irrelevant claims can reduce the impact of a strong sales appeal. A disliked politician can reduce the impact of his negative image by including irrelevant information, a story about his or her childhood or a description of the family house, in campaign advertisements. But why does the dilution effect occur? After all, it makes little sense to pay attention to non-diagnostic information in making a judgment. Why should information on dating habits make someone appear less intelligent, or a story about the birthplace of a politician lessen the impact of his or her negative image? One answer is that irrelevant information about a person, social cognition 131, makes that person seem more similar to others, and thus more average and like everyone else. An average person is less likely to have an extremely high grade point average or to be terribly negative. Judgmental heuristics. One way that we make sense of the buzzing, blooming array of information that comes our way is through the use of judgmental heuristics. A judgmental heuristic is a mental shortcut. It is a simple, often only approximate, rule or strategy for solving a problem. 32 Some examples include if a man and a woman are walking down a street, the man walks on the outside. If a particular food item is found in a health food store, it must be good for you. If a person is from a rural town in Arkansas, he or she must be intellectually backward. Heuristics require very little thought, just the selection of the rule and a straightforward application to the issue at hand. It can be contrasted with more systematic thinking in which we may look at a problem from a number of angles, assemble and evaluate as much relevant information as possible, and work out in detail the implications of various solutions. Let's look at 3 of the most common judgmental heuristics: the representative heuristic, the availability heuristic, and the attitude heuristic. The representative heuristic, according to Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, 33. When we use the representative heuristic, we focus on the similarity of one object to another to infer that the first object acts like the second one. For example, we know that high-quality products are expensive. Therefore, if something is expensive, we might infer that it is really good.